there's these two.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to start on time because then at least we have a good chance of getting 75 minutes of discussion in on this very critical issue about the future being electric, ? Good afternoon. My name is Nick Gowing. I'm here to make sure that the next 75 minutes is as productive as you would like it to be. As you can see, we have 8 panelists. That creates an interesting challenge when it comes to 75 minutes of discussion. Therefore, there will be a degree of rigor which they have all accepted, which is none of them is going to give an opening speech of 10 minutes, because actually they'll still be speaking when the session ends. And so the idea is to build forward on a number of issues that we have brainstorm beforehand to get to the cutting edge, the frontier of where the questions are and the uncertainties are on the future being electric. All of you will know the kind of parameters there are and the urgency that there is for understanding how far electric will go in so many modes of transport. I'm going to ask them to speak for 2 minutes, and if I'm generous, it'll be 3 minutes. And we have 5 particular issues that I want to get through in the next 74 minutes now. Realistically, what will the future energy mix be, and how soon will it happen? Secondly, what must be done for electricity to play a significant role in the auto sector, and what are realistic timelines? How will the challenge be overcome, like the duration of battery charges, battery disposal, and the source of lithium? What basic infrastructure is required for electric transport, including sustainable sources of electricity? What are the prospects for sustainable sources of energy for other transport modes? And how much should governments intervene and lead in promoting sustainable energy sources? And if they should intervene, how should it be? Now, I'd like you to be part of this discussion. Some of you may already have some points you want to raise. In order to create a degree of structure to this, can I encourage you to put on a bit of paper, a couple of lines, whatever you want to say, so I can have it up here and make it readable, please, as well. And then I can work out at what point your point should come into the discussion. Because what I'm going to do is expect each of the 8 panelists to lead on one of those issues. And we've talked about this in advance, so they're well prepared for that. And then they can come back as well. And it could be that on the first point, I'll come to you very quickly and say, who would like to intervene on, realistically, what will the energy future mix be and how soon will it happen? There is quite a sobering indication of certainly how some of you are feeling at this conference, because some of you may have already filled in this survey, 169 of you did, to the question, what do you think in 2020 the share of electric vehicles in new car sales in OECD countries will be? 169 of you, 42, I'll give you the percentages, 25% said less than 5% by 2020, 35% thought between 5% and 10%, 20% thought that it would be between 10 and 20%, and just under 20% thought that it would be greater than 20%. Are you following all of this? In other words, there's quite an interesting mix, but on balance, those of you who filled in this or answered this questionnaire thought that it would still be less than 5%. So there's still a lot of skepticism out there, 10 years on, how far the future will have become electric. Let's move on, and a reminder to those who are coming in, if you do want to intervene, I'm more than happy to ask for hands to be raised and so on, but sometimes it helps understanding who wants to say what about which particular element of this discussion, so that hopefully by 4:30, first of all, you'll all still be in the room, and secondly, you feel that there's a clearer understanding of the frontier and what is going to happen over the horizon on this critical issue of electric. That's a good start. Right. I could tell you many issues like that, many things that happen on television sets as well, which you never see. As it's repaired, we're going to move on to not repaired. We now have ovation, so maybe you'd like to take the other half of it down. It's going to look really weird on the cameras, I think. People wondering what the ovation is in electric. I'd like to ask Secretary of State Busaro and also B.K. Chaturvedi from the Planning Commission in India, but Secretary of State Busaro from France. Can I ask you to give us 3 minutes, and you will need translation for some of our contributions. Realistically, what will the future energy mix be, and how soon? 3 minutes, please.
Merci. Je pense que les choses vont se faire lentement.
I think that will only happen slowly and everywhere in the world, because first there have been investments in infrastructure, but it will be some long-term investment, and long-term investments in infrastructure will be needed. When we have a look at the timeline and the time schedule, so we think that over the next 30 years, so until 2030, between 80 and 90% will be based on fossil fuels in Europe. Later, it may be 35% for oil, 26% gas, 17% coal, and for renewable energy sources about 10%, as well as for nuclear. In my country, in France, the situation is somewhat different. As in the 1970s and 1980s, the points were set, and electricity is mainly being generated on the basis of nuclear energy. So in my country, the share of nuclear is much bigger. We also try to foster renewable sources of energy in order to minimize greenhouse gases, especially wind energy. But the population doesn't really accept that. There is a lot of resistance to that. We have tried to pass laws, but the national utility buys wind energy at very interesting prices, at a very interesting price level, so that for wind energy as well as for solar energy, you may wonder why we don't do it ourselves. So that leads to some kind of speculation. So energy mix is very important. To have a good mix of different sources is very important. Some countries are still reticent as far as nuclear is concerned, and other sources of energy are of growing importance if it is being accepted by the population at large. But in France, there is a real danger that it goes too much towards wind energy.
One follow-up to that, Secretary of State. Are you clear, do you think, about the future energy mix and the crossovers and when they will happen?
Je pense pour...
I think that it will take another 10 years, but maybe even 15 or 20 years before there is this change.
C'est une réflexion personnelle et non politiquement correcte.
Of course, these are some personal thoughts and may not be politically correct or may not be what politicians think. But I will not answer that.
B.K. Chaturvedi, thank you very much for your time and also keeping to the time discipline, Secretary of State. Can I ask the view from the Planning Commission in India, 3 minutes from you, about, from the view of a developing country, what the future energy mix will be and how soon?
Hello. The energy mix in the overall sector in transport will have to reflect the energy which is available globally. And let me talk therefore of India. In the Indian context, we have a shortage of around 10%, and we hope by 2030 we will have around requirement of 900 to 1100 gigawatt. That's a huge requirement. And our assessment is that in the best case scenario, our renewables will be around 12%. And in the worst case scenario, they could be around 2 to 3%. And this excludes some hydro potential. So if I apply this to the transport sector, we perceive that the railways, which have around anywhere between 50 to 60% electrical usage, they would be very well endowed, and they maybe go around 2020 or 2030 to maybe around 80 to 90%. But in the road transport sector, we expect very little transformation, because we would like, first of all, to give electricity to our people. Around 40% of the population has either very little electricity or marginal network. We would like to give it to them. We like to meet the shortages, and therefore we feel that not more than 4 to 5% of vehicles by 2020 and 2030 may come, maybe run on the electrical side. But maybe by 2040 to 2050, this number could go up substantially, because by then we hope that the solar energy technology and the battery technology would come up, and it will be able to then provide a hope. But this is in future.
You say hope, again for clarification, because there are big projects you are planning in India, hoping to in the desert. If the solar energy is seen to be more effective, could that advance those dates?
Absolutely. If we are planning around 20,000 megawatt by 2022, and we will plan more depending on the success we have. In case this goes up, we would very much like to increase the share, because we would like to reduce the share of coal. But it all depends on the cost of technology and how it is able to reduce the prices. As of now, the prices are around 6 times as much as that of coal.
And one other question about nuclear energy. You've done a big deal with the United States on fuel. What impact is that going to have in the mix?
Well, in the mix, by around 2040, nuclear energy, which we have had there with the United States, it has 2 components. First is the fast breeder reactor, and other is the use of thorium. So use of thorium and the fast breeder reactors require that we have a certain amount of corpus built up of plutonium and other fuel which we are going to use. So by 2040, we'll be working on the fast breeder reactors and others. And if by that point of time, we'll be able to build up enough corpus. So after 2040 and 2050, certainly this could grow up in a substantial manner.
Okay, thank you. Let me invite all of you to come back with your reflections of what this mix will be, and anyone as well among you in the delegates, if you want to add some perspective of the speed at which you think this could happen. Could we have a little more light in the room, please? Olaf.
I think the question is the future electric, definitely. And in a way, the question of the future energy mix should be an answer to what is it that we want to achieve. And if we do think that mitigating climate change is one of the most important things we have to do, you have to start in the other end. What does it take to meet that target by 2050? In the European power industry, we've done a study, what does it take in Europe to reduce climate emissions by 75% domestically, economy-wide in the EU. And using electricity as a transportation fuel is one of the very key points in such a scenario, increasing the electricity as part of fuel from 2% today to above 60%. And by that, you will, through efficiency, take down the use of energy by 40% and take down the emissions from transportation by 70%. So there's a definitely large role for electricity in the future energy mix. Thank you.
Henry Lee, could I ask you, as Senior Director of BYD, we've seen 2 of your cars outside. What are the calculations and assumptions you are making about this future energy mix?
Hello. This varies from country to country. If you see countries like Norway, Sweden, and Brazil, they have a quite high water and hydropower. And in France, have a quite high nuclear energy for electricity. So in global-wise, it's difficult to have one policy for each country. In terms of China, more than 83% of the electricity coming from coal. And then the renewable part, only 8.8%. From water, about 14.8%. From water, there's still a lot of potential for China to grow in the green energy sector. But we have to consider the resource structure. And in China, we have to still, in next 10, 20 years, we still need to rely heavily on coal. That's one of the facts.
Geraldine Knatz, do you want to just add, and also to the other panelists as well, just so we can get a clarification of your perspective of the way you will have to plan strategically on this mix?
Yes, I think I agree with Olaf in that in order to, say, in California, where we already have a greenhouse gas standard that the Port of Los Angeles would have to meet in 2020, we basically have to shift operations dramatically from use of fossil fuels to electric power and combine that with green energy. So we have a 10-megawatt solar project under construction in the port right now. But we pretty much have to electrify the operations. We started back in 2004 plugging the ships into shoreside electrical power, and we've pioneered the development of all-electric heavy-duty trucks that can handle full containers, which are now rolling off the assembly line. So as I said, I agree with Olaf. I think the future is electric, and it's coming very soon.
Is it going to come sooner than many think, or not?
I think for us in the Los Angeles area, because we have goals imposed on us we have to meet, it will come very soon for us. We're trying to roll out these electric applications right now as we speak. I don't think many people are aware of the fact that there are all-electric heavy-duty trucks that have a range of 100 miles, which is actually good for short trips. And then we also have a hydrogen fuel cell electric truck, a hydrogen hybrid electric truck that has an extended range of 400 miles. So these things exist. They're available. They're a little more expensive, but you have significant savings in operations.
Yamashita-san, let me ask you, if I may, what is your calculation about the future energy mix? You at Nissan are investing so much. Your president, Carlos Ghosn, is pushing hard. You've just developed the Leaf. What are your assumptions about the way this is going to develop?
Actually, I don't know. I don't know. Means like, when we look at the whole kind of the mobile or the cars, currently total emission of the CO2 by car is about 20%. Well, not only the car, it's the transportation, 20%. And how we can shift the transportation energy consumption from fossil to more electricity is the theme. But country by country, when I look at all countries, which country is really suitable for the electric car is quite different. Like France is very much from nuclear energy. So when we calculate in terms of the CO2 emission, French is probably one of the best country. We should penetrate the EV more and more. And maybe from our conversation, New Zealand or Norway is probably better. So depend on the country, the situation, I think this differs. But when we calculate the numbers in Japan, our vehicle, even if the car become 100% electricity driven, it has not big impact to the total consumption of energy as a whole. So this is my thought. So I don't know that the car EVs cannot be a driver of the shift of the energy so much, the big percent. But a certain kind of stimulation we can provide, I think.
Yamashita-san, you say you don't know, but you must have very clear planning assumptions. What are the planning assumptions you are making?
I don't know. The reason I don't know is I don't know the number for the global basis. But the country by country, we have a certain prediction.
All right. Nathan Guy, your perspective as an Associate Minister of Transport.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Well, we've got 4 million people in New Zealand. We've got 30 electric cars. We've got 32 million sheep, and I can tell you it takes a day and a half and 5 flights to get here to Leipzig. But we are here, and we're very fortunate to be here. In terms of our energy mix, well, we're about 73% of renewables. In parts of our wonderful country, we have 3 metres of rain, and we also have amazing Alps, and of course it snows there and the snow melts, and we...
This isn't a tourism conference.
Well, we've got the Rugby World Cup coming up, sir, next year, and we'd like...
Just talk about the energy mix.
We'd like everyone to come down to New Zealand. So we've got 73% of renewable energy at the moment. Our forecast and our target for 2025 is to get that up to 90%. We do have 30 electric cars. We forecast that number to grow considerably, but at the moment...
What is the number?
At the moment, we're waiting for the market to get the right incentives in terms of getting the price structure right. And if we have a fuel spike in terms of petrol prices or diesel, then we will see consumers looking favourably towards electric vehicles.
You mentioned 32 million sheep. Is that relevant to the calculation at all?
Oh, well, it is relevant, because if you're talking about climate change and emissions profile, half of our greenhouse gases come from livestock. The other half comes from vehicles and industry. Okay.
Tomita-san, quickly, your perspective on which way this mix is moving and realistically what it is likely to be and how soon, please.
Hi. My name is Tomita, JR East. I'm coming from a railway company, JR East. In the sector of railway industry, we have pretty much electrificated businesses. For example, 70% of our lines are electrified for the train operations. So we are very quite speedy in terms of electrification. The remaining 30% we have to rely on fossil fuels, and how can we reduce this dependency? Since year 2000, we have been developing a hybrid diesel rail cars, and since 2007, we are actually operating those rail cars. This technology, we will rotate a motor by energy generated by diesel engines, and also utilizing regenerative brakes, we will store the energy at the time of deceleration and utilize that energy to accelerate or stop the trains at station. This is the recycling of operating energies. We have been doing this technology for quite a long time, but lately the performance of batteries is improving dramatically, and therefore we are now in the new phase of new utilization of regenerative brakes. We will keep focusing on usage of recyclable energies in order to reduce the emission of CO2 coming from train operations. For example, our company has lots of customers every day. 60 million customers utilize our train services, and they go through our ticket gates every day. They walk through the floor at our ticket gates, and we utilize this pressure as energy. And how about using this energy to operate our trains? Is it possible to recycle energy in that way? So in the railway sector, we are working hard on the utilization of recyclable energy.
Let me remind you, if you want to contribute, please just sort of at least give me an idea of the kind of things you may want to raise in the next 50 minutes. Let's move on to Henry Lee and Yamashita-san. What must be done for electricity to play a significant role now in the auto sector? And what are the realistic timelines that you can work on? You're investing an enormous amount. How will the challenges be overcome, like the issue of battery charges, of battery disposal, and the source of lithium? You seem to have tossed up. Yamashita-san, you're going first? Okay.
3 minutes is too short to speak everything. But let me give you some statistics of Nissan Leaf, which will come to the market the fall time. That vehicle has a 160 kilometer autonomy range per one charge. This is under Los Angeles mode, and this is just kind of test mode. And the vehicle one charge can 160 kilometer the run, but if you have the quick charging system, full charge takes 30 minutes, and also that if you have a normal 200 volt home charge, it takes about 7-8 hours. So if you sit the vehicle in the garage one night, you can make a full charge. So this is a kind of statistic of my vehicle's configuration. And the maximum speed 140 kilometer per hour. I don't explain too much about this one, but anyway, that's the configuration. But I don't think some portion this kind of a vehicle is enough. When we look at the city, the resident customers, more than 80% of the people driving less than 20 kilometers per day. So 160 kilometers is enough, too much. But some of the people drive long distance, weekend, maybe once a month, or whatever the frequency, and then they like to have more at the distance. This is a configuration. So, for example, when you look at yourself, how long do you drive every day? If it's less than 100 kilometers, the EV is good enough. So that's the configuration. When you look at the whole population of total industry volume of the sales of the cars, more than 25-30% now is sold in the city area. So those are potential customers we can look at. So this is from this kind of base. I think currently the electric vehicle we are designing or try to sell might be good enough.
But let me press you. What has to be done for electricity to play a significant role now in the auto sector, for consumers to change their habits of buying?
I think that the gas price or electricity price is quite different. For example, let's take Japan's example. If you have a same kind of the range distance driving, let's say the gas or gasoline costs 10, electricity, if you charge night, it's just 1. So 1/10 of that difference. This is the big benefit for the customers. Then, the shift to the normal kind of a car to the more electric car. This is the one drive factor for the EVs. And the other one is you can charge at home. You don't need to go to the gas station. This is a real luxury. When you get up in the morning and come to the garage, every day your vehicle is ready to go. So this is a quite different experience.
Right, we'll talk about infrastructure shortly, but quickly, battery charging, battery disposal, and lithium. Is there clarity on those issues at the moment?
Durability is, we can probably guarantee enough the durability in terms of battery from the start. Let's say after 5 years usage, probably the capacity still remain more than 70-80%. This is the current performance of battery.
And battery disposal and
disposal
lithium?
is car's battery is a very super performance. So after 5 years, this remaining capacity is good enough. You can use this battery for the storage or some emergency use. So we're looking for a second use of the battery. So battery total duration, probably more than 10 years.
Okay, that's important to hear. Henry Lee, your view, please.
Thank you.
Same questions.
Yeah. So I think for electrification of mobility in the future is for sure. The answer is for sure. The matter is when and how. The thing is that the mobility today is heavily relied on fossil fuels, and this is simply not sustainable in the next 40, 50 years, not only because the resources are running out, but the price will be going up dramatically after 10, 20 years. This is one thing. The key drivers behind the electrification, first is energy security. The secondly is the CO2 emission pressures and also air pollution in the city. So these are the main drivers. But now the main obstacles for electrification, one obvious is the initial cost of the electric car is still higher than conventional cars.
Have you got prices for those cars out there?
It's still high, but there's a lot of potential to decrease the cost in terms of battery cost. Just imagine for mobile phone itself and the battery in 1994 compared to 1986 to today, there's a completely changed the pricing. And so for we are making batteries, we know there's a potential for battery cost to going down. So this cost. Secondly is the infrastructure, the charging. Because people are used to drive conventional cars, they can get gasoline every 1 or 2 kilometers, there's a gas station. But for electric cars, there's nowhere today to get charged, or the charge time is too long. So how to solve this issue is also the key to move to electrification. So these are the two elements. In terms of infrastructure, I think if there's enough investment in these charging networks, I think that's not the most difficult things to do. Now already happening in the world, in China as well, the infrastructure built up. And people just need to adapt, take time to adapt to the driving behavior, to drive electric cars. So these are the two things. So the other things, so if we solve these two issues, the other issues like you're asking about the recycling or lithium supply. Lithium supply we have calculated. In the next 50 years, there should not be a problem. There's enough reserve for supply to electric cars. And also this lithium can be recycled as well. Once the battery life ended, you can have a second use of the battery pack, and the end can be recycled. Almost majority of materials can be recycled from the battery. So you can get lithium back from the battery itself. So it's even cheaper than taken from other resource.
Before your other panelists join in, let me put to you, there was a recent roundtable discussion about stimulating low-carbon vehicle technologies. And there's a fascinating element in the report here about behavioral economics, about the issue of how customers work out whether they should make a shift. Have you yet worked out the psychology of how to shift customers towards electrical cars as opposed to the traditional cars?
Yes. There's a lot of, from different people, they have different behaviors. For ordinary people, most of them, they still have no idea of electrification, electric cars, no idea at all. So now we think at this stage, we have two options. One is the plug-in hybrid vehicle, one is a pure electric vehicles. So we have dedicated a clear customer target.
And Yamashita-san, do you agree with that? That customers, by and large, don't have an understanding of what's on offer?
Yeah, driving performance is totally different. In the fast pickup, the acceleration, it's much better than normal sports car. Once you experience this one, I don't encourage people to drive high speed, but that picking up, maneuverability, everything is a quite different world.
All right, good. Geraldine, you wanted a word, and we'll go to the Secretary of State as well.
Yes, I was just going to say that the electric utility or the municipality can do a lot to change behavior and people's acceptance in Los Angeles. We have 400 charging stations left over from our first foray into electric cars. Those are going to be upgraded, and they're adding 200 more. In addition, the utility has made a commitment to anyone who buys an electric car that within 2 to 7 days they'll provide the charging station, in their garage, whatever electrical modification needs to be made. So those are the kinds of things that I think can help drive people to make that purchase. Especially in Los Angeles, people spend all the time on the freeway, so they're going to need it.
Mr. Chaturvedi, you come from a country where vast numbers of people are buying small cars now. You're a member of the Planning Commission. Already you can see in so many cities, pollution and everything else. The impact is very clear. What is your approach to this? How you encourage people to understand the new potential of electric cars, which means they become something that people want to go out and buy, as opposed to something they're suspicious of because their neighbors haven't got it?
Hello. Our experience there in compressed natural gas was that when we wanted it to be expanded in Delhi, people wanted initially the costs. And the second is the infrastructure. So we have now developed the infrastructure for compressed natural gas in about 30 cities. And we find that since the costs are favorable and the infrastructure is there, people are wanting to use it because when they go from one city to the other, to the neighboring areas, the infrastructure is available for plugging in. So this has to be driven by the government with two stipulations. A, we must develop the infrastructure so that people can use it, and B, this must be cost effective. If these two are there, our experience is that we would be able to do this. But as of now, I mentioned that we have a shortage of electricity, and we would like to give it to domestic purposes and for other purposes. As and when we, in the next, say by 2030 or 2040, we are able to do it, we would like to expand it to vehicles. We would, however, like to expand it in the two-wheeler areas, where already it is being done in India. A large number of two-wheelers are taking up. The requirements of electricity are limited there, and that can expand in a big way because we have a large number of two-wheeler vehicles. So our approach is clearly this: expand the infrastructure and provide the reasonable costs in this. And we are, at the moment, concentrating on compressed natural gas for this purpose.
Secretary Boussereau, can I come to you? Because in France you have a clear public policy to develop, to build 60,000 electric vehicles to make them available by 2011-2012. What are you noticing about pickup on this customer issue, which helps us answer the question, what has to be done for electricity to play a significant role in the auto sector?
Il faut d'abord bénéficier d'une électricité à un coût convenable.
First of all, you need electricity at a fair price, at a reasonable price. It's no use if you have electric cars, but then can only buy very expensive electricity. So the energy balance has to be right. So we need electricity in large amounts, and we need a big series of production cars. We also need batteries, high-performance batteries, which make possible that cars are autonomous and have a long cruising range. It should also be possible for cars to be driven at night and need to be recharged quickly. In France, we have a policy of premiums, of bonuses, so that end users can buy electric cars, and there are local bonuses as well. I'm a politician at a French department, the French département, and this département provides an additional bonus of 5,000 euros. So for the end user, there is a bonus of 10,000 euros, and with that has a cheaper car compared to a conventional vehicle. Then the question of charging stations is another important matter. This is about landscaping and urban planning. Those are questions which are very important for an end user, for a consumer. So those questions are at a premium. And here the EU has to guarantee that there is a sufficient number of charging stations, that electric cars look nice. Renault, Peugeot are about to develop and engineer cars like that, which also look good. And there needs to be a financial incentive as well. So not just as far as charging is concerned, but also when you buy a car. In France, towns and cities buy whole fleets of cars. Municipalities, the post office buys large fleets of cars. And if that goes well, then there will be a higher acceptance among the end user.
Is a former executive director of the International Energy Agency. Claude, a couple of points you wanted to make.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to have a little bit of caution of using the energy mix for the reasoning, because we understand that for many years, there will not be a big amount of electric cars. That means that what we have to take into account for energy use is the marginal energy which is produced. And the marginal energy which is produced will be almost everywhere, perhaps not in Norway, perhaps not in New Zealand, but even in France, will be fossil fuel. And it is crystal clear for China, of course. The marginal energy which will be consumed will be fossil fuel. And often even coal. That means that the CO2 balance is worse than a good diesel car, except if, and that point should be added, if we work very strongly on carbon capture and sequestration. I think that carbon capture and sequestration is a key point for developing electric cars. Otherwise, the CO2 balance is bad. And the second point is that, well, most of these cars will be refueled when the owner comes back from his office or her office at 7 p.m. At the very time the TV set is set on, it can be a total catastrophe for the grid. Not to say it should not be done, but that means that there is another prerequisite, which is develop smart grids. Those grids which...
All right. Because I want to pick up on that now with the panel, smart grids. There are a lot of questions which have come in already about infrastructure. They're all repeating themselves significantly about how the infrastructure can cope and then what has to be done. You'll remember that that was the third point. I'm going to come to that in a moment. But Tomita-san, you just wanted to say one thing on the last point.
Yes, I'm working for a railway company. You're talking about electric vehicles and other means of transportation, or we are talking about electrification of vehicles, and I'm sure the development technology will push the introduction of such vehicles into the society. I agree with that opinion. However, in terms of usage of electricity, railway is doing much better job than automobiles, especially modal usage for mid and long distance transportation. Of course, it is important to think about electric cars, but please do not forget the usefulness of railway as a very efficient electric transportation mode. Depending on my experience, the high-speed railway, urban railway, when we think about the energy efficiency, there is still big room to improve the efficiency. With little energy, we can carry lots of passengers, lots of goods. To take that perspective, I think we should think about the share of total or intermodal transportation. Each mode of transport has its strongness and weakness. I think we should think about that first and further discuss about the infrastructure for electrification, because it always requires an additional cost.
Not all of you have put your names on. Rather than coming to you, I'm going to recognise Marie-Yvonne Plessis-Fressard. What is the impact of extended use of electricity for cars on the electric grid? Characteristics, what are the constraints and the opportunities? Olaf, you're going to lead on the third question about basic infrastructure required now for electric transport, not just cars, even the trains, and what we're going to hear about from the ports as well. What is required for electric transport, including sustainable sources of electricity? Lead off on our discussion on that.
Thank you very much. I think my first and most important message is that the basic infrastructure, that's the great thing about electricity. It's there. The basic infrastructure for electricity is there. And I agree with Komandil in that for the first years, the demand, even of a successful rollout of electric vehicles, will be limited in terms of the total power market, which means that it's really about getting this market to work and getting more vehicles out there that would be the most important challenge. And this is a two-tier, in a way, strategy. On the one hand, it's how can you electrify transportation? And secondly, how can you decarbonize electricity? Let me give a couple of comments on each of them. In how to electrify transportation, you need to do a range of things, of course. You need to have placing on the market, you need incentives, like in Norway there's strong incentives. You need to cover concerns about safety. There's a discussion of whether there's too little noise. You need to work on standards. The more work you can do on standards, the easier it will be to have global solutions. And on infrastructure, you need to find communication standards. You need to find, of course, you need charging stations. But that's, in a way, the very last bit. So that's a very few words on what is the requirements on infrastructure when it comes to electric vehicles. When it comes to decarbonizing the electricity sector or the power sector, this is very much about four big solutions. It's energy efficiency, it's renewables, it's carbon capture and storage, and it's nuclear. And on one point I disagree with Mr. Mandil. CCS is not the short-term solution. It's very much a long-term thing, but it will take many years before that's, in a way, in a big way. What we will see over the next 10 years, particularly in Europe, is a large deployment of renewables. We look at several hundred terawatt-hours of new wind power. Wind is, of course, producing electricity when the wind blows. It means that you need a lot of balancing. And this is a very interesting connection to the development of electric vehicles with batteries. There is a storage potential that can work both ways. You can charge the car when the power is cheap, and you can actually release energy when the power is expensive. So we believe that not in the very short term, but over time, there should be a two-way communication. You need smart grids. You need the information technology in the cars so that electric vehicles can play a role in storage and in balancing of the power market, and that will also contribute to decarbonize the electricity sector.
Olive, are the economics of this becoming clearer?
I think that when it comes to the power sector, again, for Europe, there are strong binding targets. There are some concerns at the moment about the carbon policies, but there is a strong push also on delivering strong carbon policies. I think the difficult part, as always, is when many governments and many organizations need to get their act together in standards. And of course, there's an issue, as several have raised, on costs when it comes to electric vehicles. There is a role for many in how to bring these costs down.
All of you then, the issue of sustainable sources of electricity. Nathan, give me some insight onto the dilemmas of trying to create the sustainable sources of electricity as the push for electricity goes on.
Oh, well, I think it's important in our case down in New Zealand, where I talked about before, we have a lot of renewables with the hydro plants, but of course at certain times of the year you have drought, so we fall back on thermal generation when our hydro lakes get very low. Of course, we have a philosophy in our country, we don't want any nuclear plants, so at the moment we're trying to encourage wind generation, and that's working particularly well. I take the point that was just raised there. Windmills are efficient for some of the time. They're inefficient, of course, when the wind isn't blowing, or at times there is too much wind. But if there's an opportunity to store some of that wind generation, then that's going to help into the future as well. Also, I guess, as technology moves forward in terms of thermal generation, there's an opportunity to capture and store some of the emissions coming out of the thermal generation plant. So it's very much a fine balancing act.
Henry Lee, can I ask you, do you have a clarity from your perspective in China about sustainable sources of electricity? You've re-emphasized the fact that China relies so heavily on coal, but can you see a dramatic, smart way forward to develop the electricity and produce it in order to fuel the kind of transport modes that you are developing?
Yeah, today already happening in China. That policy is clear. That now government is removing smaller thermal power plants, coal power plant. They just close it if the efficiency equipment is too old, low efficiency, and then moving to high efficiency thermal power plants. And studying also CO2 capture technology for implement in these thermal power plants. This is one thing. But China still heavily relied on coal. That's the resource we have. This for sure. But at the same time, the new additional electricity generation, they will consider more renewable, either the CO2 neutral, like nuclear power, also wind energy, solar energy. So these are new directions. New investment are really focused on these renewable energy resources and hydropower as well.
And Yamashita-san, same question about do you have a clarity of where sustainable sources of electricity are going to come from if there is going to be this enormous leap forward?
I think ultimately the shape of the energy is the electricity. Everything can go to the electricity, and the electricity can generate to any type of the different kind of the energy. So this cannot be done by any other source of energy. From that viewpoint, this diversity of electricity is really attractive. And then the one point is depending on the countries, each situation, you can generate electricity any method. Cost might be the issue, but you can resolve this one by technology. From that sense, I have a big hope in electricity, the more and more usage in the future.
Minister Busaro, can I ask you, do you see this problem of sustainable sources of electricity being a limiter on your plans in government, and the same for your planning permission in India? Sustainable sources of electricity, if you don't have them, then it becomes more difficult to develop the kind of electric capacity that we're talking about here.
Dans un pays comme la France, l'énergie du charbon n'existe.
In a country such as France, there is practically no coal energy being used anymore. Hydropower has been exploited in mountainous regions or in other places where it can be used. Then there is tidal energy, which is quite difficult to tackle from a technical point of view. So what remains is nuclear power, and I've already explain to you what the government desires, which is to increase the share of solar and wind energy with a purchasing obligation for the energy suppliers, especially when it comes to solar and wind power, as I've just said. The solar and wind sector is currently in a phase of strong development. And of course, there were side effects and additional effects in the sense that we realized that farmers, for example, built buildings, barns, where they said they wanted to keep their cattle, but what they did at the end of the day was they mounted photovoltaics on the roofs of these barns in order to get the funding for it. So we decided that it was time to change legislation in that respect, because it was impossible for our energy companies to go on buying that electricity. And there were similar effects in wind energy, where we saw offers to put up wind wheels and mills, and this was not possible because France is a densely populated country where wind power systems would have to be installed directly next to the neighbors.
The best chance apart from nuclear, but it is work in progress. It will depend on how the technology develops and how the costs go down. Second, as for the carbon capture, I'm afraid this is again work in progress. The costs are much too high, and it is very difficult for us to say that we will be able to do this except for the pilot stage. World over, I remember perhaps you yourself had taken an interview of one of the Scottish power company. I was watching it, and So there's very little carbon capture. So I think that this is just now more under discussion, more pilot plant, and it's more work in progress.
Before we move on to the modes and move on to Geraldine, can I just, Olaf, come to you and say, you are Europe's largest renewable energy company. How much do you sense that the thinking is changing? People out there are prepared to take commercial risk, technological risk, and things are now moving much faster, or are the views still rather traditional?
I think for the moment, the main challenge is not within the power industry, but it's closer to how to develop the electric vehicles. But there are interfaces which are quite interesting and where there's a high attention. And I think there's one element to remember, and that's the efficiency gain in terms of energy going from fossil to electric is so large that even with electricity produced from coal-fired power, it's competitive to the fossil internal combustion engine when it comes to emissions. So this is not something we have to wait for. Let's wait for the decarbonized electricity sector before we start on electric vehicles. We can start today with both. I think that's quite an important perspective in how to take this further.
Because there's a question here from Stefan Engels, for example, talking about the automotive industry needing to speed up developing alternative concepts. Does he have a point that really even they are not being radical enough?
At least seen from how we can develop this market, the sooner we can get even better products out there, I'm sure that will drive the demand, and I think that the power industry will be able to deliver that in a quite sufficient way.
How much are the problems with banks and finance at the moment going to limit the potential at the moment, given what we're going through with the euro recession, everything else under the sun?
Talking for the power industry, I believe that there are some very strong incentives in many countries when it comes to developing renewable energy that mostly does not go via the state budgets, which means that they are somehow a bit protected in the current turmoil.
And banks will lend for new projects, do you believe?
I do.
You do? Okay. Let's move on, Geraldine, and also Tomita-san, about railways, about docks. The fourth question, what are the prospects for sustainable sources of energy for other transport modes? What are you seeing changing in the shipping and your transport business?
Well, I see a growing trend towards, everyone focusing on reducing carbon emissions and moving towards green power and electrifying operations. Again, it depends on, where you are in the world. Just so you have some perspective, a ship that's at berth for a day will release a ton of emissions into the air, 1 ton. So that's why hooking ships to shoreside electrical power was so important in our large urban port. But up in the Pacific Northwest, where they had hydropower and the power was 6 cents a kilowatt hour, ships have been plugging in for some time. And so a technology that a lot of ship owners resisted when oil prices went up to $150 a barrel, all of a sudden the cruise lines were pressing me. When are you going to get that power out to the berth so we can start plugging in? Because cruise ships with 1,000 crew and several thousand passengers, even sitting at the dock, draw a significant amount of power. If I had every ship in my port plug in at the same time, the power equivalent would be the power needs of a small-sized city. So it is a significant amount of power needed for these types of operations. In our area, we're looking at solar. And I think the big constraint we face in Southern California is not having enough desert to lay out solar arrays, but being able to permit the transmission lines because so much of the desert is protected area for habitats.
And what happens when you raise these major challenges of the amount of power that your ships will consume in order to be more efficient with those providing the power, the utility companies?
Fortunately, in my case, the utility company is a sister agency of the port, so we have a very close working relationship, and providing enough power for our needs has not been a difficulty. As a matter of fact, in order to promote the shippers to plug in, our sister agency lowered the electricity rates to try and get the ships to plug in, because they wanted that, additional source. It was a new source of revenue for them. So in my particular case, that has not been an issue. In other port areas, they don't have the power that they need for ships to plug in. And I'm not saying it's a solution that fits at every port city. It really depends on your individual locality. It may not be the right method to take, depending on what your goals are, whether reducing emissions or, trying to go for your carbon footprint or whatever. So there's a variability depending on your location.
Tomita-san, what about your reflection from the railway's point of view? I was tempted to ask you earlier when you were talking about the fact that when trains go very fast, presumably they use an enormous amount of power. Therefore, you are draining the grid as well.
Yes, you are right. Railway consume a large amount of power, electricity. As everyone is discussing, the supply of electricity depends which source we utilize. Always we have to face the limit. And how can we utilize by the private sectors or public sectors? Within the transport sector, how should we utilize this limited resource? Of course, the railways industry has a high percentage of electrification. Therefore, in terms of energy efficiency, we are much better than cars. We just use 1/10 or 1/15 of energy to transport people or goods. But in order to even bring up the efficiency of energy usage, as you said, maybe we can slow down the speed of trains, or we can store the energy generated during deceleration to operate other trains, or we will carry batteries on trains to store regenerative energies to operate that trains. Also, reduction of weight of rail cars. This is also very crucial. For example, our bullet train, Shinkansen rail cars, the weight is only 50% of what we used to produce for bullet trains. That's one of our activities we are engaging in order to enhance our efficiency.
The Indian perspective, from the Planning Commission, when you have an enormous rail system, it's no longer coal, but it's still producing enormous amounts of pollution. Are you tempted to move down the track of, excuse the pun, moving down the track of mass electrification of your railway system, given it's so fundamental to moving a very large number of people in your country, maybe not the richest and not the middle class, but those who still want to move and have a right to move in your country of 1.2 billion?
You are absolutely right that we have a large number of people, but you are not correct that we are not moving them now on the electrification route. Over the last 10 years...
What are the prospects then?
I will just tell you the number. So we are at the moment around 63% of the freight moves on electrified rails, and around 50% of the passengers are moving on electrified trains. And our prospects are every year we try to increase by 2 to 3%. So in the next 15 to 20 years, and I had mentioned earlier also, we hope that we should be able to do more than 80 to 85% on the electrified route, because we feel that this is, first of all, mass transit, and second, it is far more environmental friendly. If you see the carbon emissions from this as compared to cars, it is far, far less. Therefore, at the moment, our share of rails is around 30%, 35%, we want to increase it to 60%, 55 to 60%, and that's the plans we have so that we can reduce our emission and improve our carbon efficiency. This is therefore, we have no hesitation in moving towards electrification of our rail system.
All right. Now, in the last 10 minutes, what I want to do is move on to probably the most difficult question, but for which there are many different variations in some of the questions I've been sent. But it's actually what we were going to turn to anyway, about governments and governments intervening, the role of government in leading and promoting sustainable energy sources. How should they intervene? Should they intervene? The role of government here in one question in market deployment of electric cars. Another question, what regulatory changes are necessary to make the transition to electric transport beneficial? Nathan Guy, you're in government. Give us your perspective from New Zealand before I ask the others.
Well, first of all, I think the government has to create the right framework. In terms of what we've done in our country of New Zealand, is one of the first things we did is we reformed the Resource Management Act, which is basically an environmental act. It was taking so long to get projects of national significance up and running, often 3 to 4 years bumbling along through the Environment Court. We've created an Environmental Protection Authority where projects of national significance could be a hydro plant, hydro power station that would go through this process in a 9-month period. So we've streamlined that process, which means we can get these big projects up and running. The other thing that we've done is we've tried to reduce red tape. Governments and bureaucracy are very good at creating red tape, and it's politicians' job to push back and go through with a fine-tooth comb, in my opinion, and say, no, a lot of these regulations don't help economic growth, and we need to remove some of those impediments. So we've gone about doing that. I think the other important thing is that what governments can do is they obviously have several levers they can pull. One of those is taxation. The other one is a subsidy. And I guess the other one is encouraging market to deliver on innovation. The other important one is, I guess it's slightly symbolic. In our case, the Minister for the Environment, he drives an electric car, which is extremely powerful. So that's, leading from the front.
Olive, can I come to you? You work for a large company which makes a profit, presumably, from sustainability. About the role of government, is it governments that should be doing it, or is it companies like you?
I think you need both. I think on the one hand, companies
Are you right, Geraldine?
And suppliers can have a role in innovation. But when it comes to standardization, it's very important that governments and larger bodies have a real say to foster the development and not least to getting the unit cost down. I think secondly, from the example from New Zealand, if the political will is stronger than the short-term consumer pickup, I think in Europe something 17% of vehicles bought is from public sector. To my understanding, that's about 500,000 cars a year. So there are opportunities for the public sector if they really want to, in terms of finding ways of developing this market in innovative ways.
Geraldine, given the contradictions that you can face wanting to implement sustainable forms of fuel and energy for your ships, but you're having difficulty because of the stress it might put on the system. In California, we know a lot of the problems there in terms of the deficit and the problems with the utility companies. Which way do you think it should be moving in your part of the world? Because we've had, I can read his writing just about, Henry Posner, chairman of the Iowa Interstate Railroad Company, I think it is, where electrification hasn't been justified for much of the railroad traffic, and it's virtually disappeared to be replaced by, presumably, diesel.
Yes, and I think what we actually had to do in the case of Los Angeles was because we were such a big port, and about 45% of all the goods coming into the United States came through our port complex. We had a certain amount of leverage, recognizing that certain companies had to do business with us, and though they don't really like to hear us say that, we used that leverage to impose these requirements on the companies we did business with in exchange for growth opportunities. So we told a terminal operator, say, you may double your throughput or your volume through your facility as long as you agree to doing certain things. Once we had done that, we found we had more leverage than the regulators, who found they couldn't regulate in international commerce, but it paved the way for some follow-on regulation that happened, you know, really at the national level and at the state level. So, you know, as a port, we set standards when ports normally don't set standards for these kinds of things. It hurt us competitively. It was used against us, you know, but we had to get through that hurdle in order to be able to grow our port in a sustainable way.
Yamashita-san and Tomita-san, what's your view about the role of government intervening, setting the framework? Should it act in a hard way or a softer way than some are at the moment?
I think any type of the government support of the subsidies is really appreciated. First of all, as explained by the kind of presented by France, that incentives when you purchase the vehicle is really helpful. But I don't think this will continue forever. So during this time frame, we have to develop the low cost the EVs, low cost batteries. That's I think our task. But anyway, the first stage of incentive is really helpful. But the most important part is how each government helped creating infrastructure, charging station. But charging station is not necessarily like quick charging that away from the home. Home charging is the most significant part for electric vehicle penetration, I think.
Tomita-san, the role of government, how critical is that, or can it be left now more to the market? In other words, the softer role, as Amar was talking about this morning.
This is a very important issue. The energy is limited, and how do we allocate this limited energy to different models? Should we leave it to the principle of the market, to the users? I think that's the best way. There was a question regarding the usageness of electrification of trains. Of course, there is no wonder. It has very good meaning. But if the cost is too high for electrification, maybe a diesel car with a hybrid technology is another alternative. I think such kind of new idea is also useful, and we promote the competition between different transport models and provide fair choices to the consumers. And what the government has to do is to provide fair rules. And there are different important factors: the congestion of traffic, pollution, or the cost of infrastructure. So those are the important factors to facilitate fair competitions between different models, and the rest should be left to the public.
You are a member of a government which has been very forward on this issue, and we've heard subsidies, we've heard about massive subsidies, encouragement and so on, and government taking a lead, pushing people, encouraging people down the track towards certainly electric. What's your view about the much broader landscape when you look at other countries, other transport secretaries you're dealing with, about whether there's now a consistency emerging on which the way forward is to ensure there's a greater use of electricity in modes of transport?
Oui, je crois que le consensus est à trois niveaux. D'abord, le niveau européen.
There are three different levels. First of all, the Europe of 27 or an even larger Europe should be able to support research and development into new sources of energy and new ways of transport. You have mentioned the market. Europe has to promote and foster competition. But this competition has to be regulated. For instance, for aviation, classic routes have to be replaced, and the control over airspace has to be revised and has to be put on a European level so as to save energy as well. Completely new navigation systems, the César system, which was created under the French presidency, which will revolutionize the airspace and control of airspace. And this will be good for the corporate world as well as the users. Then we need R&D policies for new means of transport, infrastructure policies, and when you bundle all that together, just as has been the case for electric cars, municipalities have to react as well. A good example are streetcars, are trams. There were not any in France anymore, but now there are new tram systems, new streetcar systems, and hence the car vanishes from city centers. We need high-speed links in Europe, Paris-London, Paris-Madrid, Paris-Portugal, Switzerland, Paris-Italy. And 2 new lines are to be built over the next couple of years, and that will also lead to a situation that goods will be transported by rail. And with that, there can be more frequent regional trains, which are a good alternative vis-à-vis the classic car. Also on rivers, on waterways, as Géraldine has already said, at a worldwide level, shipping is very, very important. However, we have seen that it will be necessary and possible to reduce the speed of ships and boats in order to save energy. At the moment, it is 8 days. If it were to take longer, it wouldn't really matter. But you could save a lot of energy if boats and ships were made slower. So here, politicians have to become active and have to keep in mind what the needs are of the population at large and of the corporate world.
Come to the end of our time, but the principles are clear. How much are the current economic problems and pressures on so many countries now going to slow this process down? In other words, the gap between aspiration and financial capability, how much is that going to slow down this move towards electric?
Je crois exactement le contraire.
I think the opposite. I'm of the opinion that the economic crisis has slowed down economic activity around the globe, and I think it has brought us to a more sensitive way of consuming energy. It will force us to be more sensitive. The financial crisis in Europe, around the world, shows that we have to reduce public costs, public expenditures, and there is no better way than introducing sensitive public transports that consume less energy. So I'm of the opinion that the current difficulties that the economies face will bring us into this direction, because at the end of the day, it's a way of saving, both for countries and for companies.
All of you for your contributions. Thank you as well for being here still at the end. It means we've taken you, I think, to something close to the frontier of where the discussion is at the moment. Thank you also for your questions. I didn't come to recognise you individually because it seemed to me that we had a good dynamic going, and I hope I asked almost all the questions that you funneled up to me. We've shown that there's a great aspiration, an urgent need, but there are enormous gaps still to be filled in terms of how we get from here to there, wherever there is, maybe in 2020 or perhaps before that. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll be discussing this further in plenary tomorrow morning.